David Bentley Hart has just released his brand new book, All Things Are Full of Gods, The Mysteries of Mind and Life. And I'm going to try to act as a lesser mediator of Hart's ideas in this book to help fellow readers be able to digest the essential concepts in each chapter. David Bentley Hart is one of the most brilliant philosophers of our generation, but for many without advanced degrees in theology or philosophy, engaging with Hart's work can feel like a daunting task. But I'm telling you that engaging with his work is absolutely worth it, even if you end up in a position of disagreement with him at various points. So whether you've got a PhD in continental philosophy or you just like grappling with the perennial questions around life and God, and you might not have any fancy degrees connected to your name, I hope we can unpack the essential ideas of this important book together. Today we're going to tackle chapter 1, which is entitled The Irreducible. But before we begin, we should address some foundational points about this book. First of all, Hart admits in the introduction that this is really a follow-up to the experience of God, being, consciousness, and bliss. Now, that book has been one of the most influential books in my own theological and philosophical formation. So it's hard for me to imagine what engaging with All Things Are Full of Gods would be like without having that background knowledge. Would I recommend reading it? Absolutely. Would I say that you have to read it to understand this? No, I don't think so. But again, that might be hard for me to say because I have read it. I do think you don't have to read this, have to read The Experience of God first. And in some sense, given the structure of this book is laid out as a Socratic or Platonic dialogue, some readers might actually find that comprehension comes much more easily in this format than the format of Hart's writing in The Experience of God. Now, on the subject of the format of the writing in this book, when Hart said in the intro that this would be how the book was going to be laid out, I wasn't sure how I felt about that. But within the first few minutes of reading, I realized that this choice to have the book structured in this particular way in the form of a dialogue was 100% the right move. In fact, as a quick aside, I think much of C.S. Lewis's writing in fiction, especially in the Space Trilogy and in much of Narnia, I realized while reading this that it might actually be better to think of what Lewis was trying to do there as a Socratic, Platonic dialogue with just some decorative fictional ornaments around it. And that's not to diminish Lewis's fiction writing. It just seems like, I think that might be what Lewis was trying to do. For Lewis, and of course in this book, the characters function as symbolic representations of differing philosophical or theological commitments. And now I think this might really be the best way to grasp these concepts. This might be the best format to do that in. Whether it's in something like Lewis's Paralandra or in this book by David Bentley Hart, this kind of format, the Platonic Socratic dialogue, allows the characters in that story or in dialogue to steelman arguments in a way that decenters you as the reader from your position and invites you to inhabit their perspectives. And I think this might give you an opportunity as the reader to have a less biased engagement with their ideas through that practice, and that is often coined in cognitive science as decentering. So I'm stepping out of my perspective and lens, and I'm trying to put myself in the position of someone else. And I actually think, I think there's plenty of scientific backing behind this, that decentering helps us to step out of our particular blind spots and biases by inhabiting the perspective of another person. One other word before beginning in the engagement that we want to do together on chapter 1. I want to address Hart's decision to center the story around a dialogue among Greek gods. Now, as a pastor, which is my day job, I recognize how this move might be off-putting and confusing to the average pew-sitting Christian. Truth be told, Hart has never seemed to care about offending the common lay Christian sitting in the pews. I often wish he chose another approach or had a different demeanor on this, but I'm going to set that qualm I have aside for the time being. And engagement with the work of C.S. Lewis, and we've already mentioned him already, that might actually be a great bridge to understanding Hart's more positive disposition towards these pagan gods. In Lewis's view, the gods of the Greek pantheon should not be completely dismissed by the light of Christ as utter, worthless, demonic fantasies. Instead, through C.S. Lewis's vantage point, we could see the gods of the myths as representations of human longings for truth, goodness, and beauty. Perhaps even in their distorted image, they represent some sort of angelic powers that should have been subordinate to the one God who is beyond all categorization of being and non-being, but revealed in Christ. For both Lewis and Hart, these myths find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ, where they can be properly reoriented and subordinated under his rule. The four Greek gods Hart chose to represent sometimes divergent and sometimes complementary philosophical voices are Psyche, Eros, Hermes, and Hephaestus. Understanding what each of those Greek gods historically represent is a key to understanding their role in the competing and contrasting dialogue. Psyche was the goddess of soul. As Hart puts it, she, quote, stands on both sides of the division between divine and mortal, celestial and terrestrial, supernal and mundane. Hart confesses that Psyche speaks for his own convictions regarding the structure of life and mind. In some ways, you could see Psyche as Hart's point of view, but it's actually more complicated than just that. If there was an antagonist in this story, you could point to Hephaestus, the god of fire, volcanoes, forging, and blacksmithing. Hart says that Hephaestus also speaks for me, or at any rate my doubts and hesitations, my impatience with an attitude of absolute certitude, where some degree of uncertainty seems not only inevitable, but virtuous, and perhaps even for my frustration at not being any better able than anyone else to prove my convictions on these issues to be absolutely correct to the world at large, or even to myself. Should Hephaestus really be thought of as the antagonist? I welcome your thoughts in the comment section on that question, but clearly from the get-go, there is an antagonistic relationship between Psyche and the god of blacksmithing. Finally, there are two other gods in this story, and in the first chapter, they don't play as central of a role, but it's still important that we know who they are and the role that they play. Eros is one of those gods. Eros was the god of love, and Eros was married to Psyche. For Hart, quote, Eros speaks for my beliefs regarding the ultimate end of rational desire and mental intention. The final god, who again doesn't play as central of a role in this first chapter, is Hermes, the messenger of the gods, the divine intermediary between heaven and earth. As Hart describes him, he is also a deity of boundaries and meeting places. In this story, Hermes acts as Hart's voice, speaking for Hart's view on the mysteries and nature of language. Maybe in some ways, my role in this series will be a bit like Hermes. I have a master's in Christian thought. I'm not a true PhD in academia. I'm comfortable in my role as a sort of mediator between those concepts and ideas in academic theology and philosophy that seem beyond mere mortals, and the place where most mortals can receive the message. If you're new around here, I welcome you to my podcast, Deep Talks, Exploring Theology and Meaning Making. Now, there is no way to do justice to Hart's work in its totality here, but we're going to try. So let's dig in to chapter 1. All right, let's begin chapter 1. Now, again, I'm assuming that you've done the reading already. You've read chapter 1, and of course, there will be spoilers if you haven't done the reading. I'd encourage you, though, please read chapter 1 first. Don't use this and then go to chapter 1. I would think it would be best if you read Hart's work in his own words first, and then used what I'm doing to maybe help you clarify your thoughts, maybe come up with another person that you can kind of dialogue with as you're thinking through the concepts in each chapter. Let's begin by talking about the setting and the characters. The chapter is set in a garden where three Greek gods, Eros, Hermes, and Hephaestus, are lying on these benches that they're made of like this ethereal marble substance. And then Psyche enters the scene, and she is holding a rose. And then she comes and sits down on a nearby bench where the dialogue ensues. The primary discussion is between Psyche, who again represents Hart's views, or what Hart really wants to believe most of the time, and Hephaestus, who defends the materialist perspective, or, as Hart admits in the introduction, Hephaestus can represent Hart's own periods of doubt and question. I love Hart's admission of this, that Hephaestus isn't just like a straw man that he's trying to take down, that this is at times his own doubts and struggles, which I actually kind of found surprising. Given Hart's history of writing on this subject and public persona, one could easily get the sense that the brutality with which he often unleashes on the materialist dogma, that based on that picture, you might get the assumption that Hart never once questions validity of his own perspective. But in admitting this about Hephaestus and hearing and reading Hephaestus's arguments, we can see that that's not the case, that Hart is actually being intellectually honest about the strength of the materialist position. People that believe it are not stupid. Is Hephaestus' arguments as steel-manned as Psyche's arguments? No. It reminded me a bit of the dialogues between Ransom and Weston in C.S. Lewis's Perelandra, where it's clear to the reader that Ransom's perspective is the one the reader should side with. But there are plenty of times when the strength of Weston's arguments in that book are incredibly alluring and persuasive. The difference here with Hart is that there is no association, at least thus far, with Hephaestus being some personification of evil, as was the case for C.S. Lewis's character of Weston in Perelandra. Eros and Hermes are not as central to the dialogue in this first chapter, but they still play an important role, and we're going to address that in a moment. What is the central debate between Psyche and Hephaestus all about? Well, the argument revolves around three central themes or subjects. The first of which is the nature of reality. Is the fundamental nature of reality reducible to matter and nothing more, as Hephaestus argues? Number two, the phenomenology of consciousness. What is behind the nature of conscious experience? Is it reducible to the materialist explanation of reality? Or does our conscious experience poke a hole in that materialist framework? And number three, the relationship, if any, between mind and matter, consciousness and brains, spirit and body. Now let's address each character's central arguments and perspectives in this chapter, starting with Psyche. Psyche argues that mental acts, such as deliberation and decision-making, are not reducible to material causes. Consciousness, intentionality, and mental unity are fundamental aspects of reality that cannot be explained by physical processes alone. She asserts that all rational activity, from perception to complex reasoning, is possible only because of the mind's engagement with a, quote, infinite horizon of intelligibility, end quote, which she equates with God. Thus, she concludes that the existence of all things is grounded in an infinite act of intelligence, God. Now, if you've read Hart's The Experience of God, you will instantly realize that Psyche is the voice of that book. Reality is not reducible to matter. The infinite horizon of intelligibility, the ground of all being and intelligence, is that which we call God. Rational activity is the byproduct of our finite participation in the infinite horizon of intelligibility. If this is true, as Psyche believes, then the physical matter in our skulls that we call our brains does not produce mind, nor is it just an inanimate container of our mind or consciousness. And we'll address that question in a little more depth in future chapters. One final note on Psyche's perspective on the relationship between consciousness and brains. She makes the important argument that consciousness and subjective experience are fundamentally first-person phenomena that cannot be understood through third-person scientific methods, because the third-person perspective of science is merely the transjective meeting point of multiple first-person phenomena. So you and I observing the same effects of a science experiment, it only has validity when we start with the assumption that our individual first-person perspectives are real. If they aren't real, then we've undercut the very ground and foundation for doing science, which is shared observation, mutually a transjective meeting point of shared first-person conscious experience. It only works if you and I assume that our first-person perspectives are real. If we undercut that, then we've undercut science. This is such an important argument made by Psyche in this chapter. Now, I'm uncomfortable coining a singular term to define Psyche's philosophical perspective at this point. We might be tempted, those of you that have engaged with philosophy of the mind, etc., you might be tempted to use a term like idealism or vitalism to describe Psyche's position. I think at this point I am not comfortable using those terms, and as we look ahead in future chapters, we might see why Hart believes that those terms are insufficient. Now let's talk about Hephaestus and his perspective, which is much more easy to identify with clear philosophical categorization. His perspective represents a materialist viewpoint, and perhaps we could more accurately or more specifically say a reductive materialism or reductive physicalism. He consistently expresses skepticism about Psyche's conclusions. He maintains that all phenomena, including mental states, can be explained as the result of material causes. It's just normal materialist dogma. For Hephaestus, all organic life, even organic life, the very bedrock of life and what we might coin as consciousness, are merely the products of chemical interactions, material processes, and natural selection. It's purely bottom-up emergence without any need for top-down emanation of mind. According to Hephaestus, even gods can be reduced to the natural fluctuations and energies of the ethers from which they arose. He challenges Psyche's claim that consciousness cannot be understood through empirical methods. He says, hey, you know what? Just because we can't explain consciousness currently through physical causation doesn't preclude the possibility that future scientific advancements will keep us from doing so. After all, look at all of what we know now that we didn't know in the past, that simply the materialist scientism of our day has helped us to better understand. And it's a fair argument. It's one you might commonly hear in debates like this. Though Hart says Hephaestus is the voice of his own doubts, it was really hard for me as I was reading this book to not hear the voice of Richard Dawkins whenever Hephaestus spoke. Now, clearly, the dialogical tension is primarily between Psyche and Hephaestus, but let's not neglect the voice of Eros and Hermes in this first chapter. Let's start by talking about Eros's perspective, which is a minor perspective, but there is, oh my gosh, I caught this in this first chapter, and this is a testament to Hart's brilliance, but Hart's brilliance and what I think is observing what is true about reality. Now, I could probably use a few more readings of this first chapter, but on initial readings, I didn't notice a single instance of disagreement between Eros and anything that Psyche said. Only affirmation. So Eros, as the husband, seems to only affirm what Psyche is saying and arguing. Now, I think there's something really profound about this. If we understand that Eros represents love, then what Hart seems to be presenting here is the ideal vision of the unity between love and reason. He sees no contradiction in the marriage between love and reason, and suggests in the unity between the two that they are inseparable aspects of mental life, and that even they're present in all forms of life. This is a profound insight, even though Eros's presence is rather understated in this first chapter. Now, let's not neglect Hermes' role in this chapter, the messenger of the gods. His role, again, is not as central as what we could call our protagonist, Psyche, and maybe the antagonist, Hephaestus, but he does play an important role. One of the things that Hermes does as the messenger of the gods, the one who defines boundaries, as Hart puts it, is Hermes seems to be in agreement throughout this chapter with Psyche. But one of the interesting things that Hermes does is he finds a way of affirming some of the truth that Hephaestus is pointing to while offering a corrective critique to that which Hephaestus is getting wrong. So, for example, Hermes doesn't deny the process of biological evolution that Hephaestus keeps pointing to. He simply argues that he's getting the interpretation of what biological evolution means wrong. For example, his argument would be something like evolution is true, so the material process that you might be describing is true, but it doesn't inherently point to a mechanistic, deterministic view of a mindless material universe. Hermes instead affirms that, Hephaestus, you're not talking total gibberish. It's not complete nonsense. It's not like everything you say is antithetical to Psyche's belief in God. Yes, there's a process of emergence in creation, where things do complexify and can develop. But what are they developing? Yes, they're developing this capacity for a greater conscious participation, but a participation in what? If not in the very ground of all conscious experience, which is God. So yes, you are accurately descripting the how of some things while missing the why and missing the telos. The description of emergent material processes alone is not a satisfactory method for describing the very nature of reality. If one were to do additional research on the topics in the first chapter, what would you be searching for? I'm not going to specifically offer book recommendations right now, but I just want to identify 4 of the subject matters, philosophical subject matters, that are being presented in this first chapter and likely throughout the rest of the book. Most certainly are going to be explored throughout the rest of the book, that I want to give some name to, so you could be like, okay, what are they actually arguing about over here? One of which we could say is the mind-body problem. And in this dialogue, there's an exploration of whether the mind is a distinct substance from the body or an emergent property of it. And so we see that tension. Secondly, you could do digging into debates on the relationship between consciousness and subjectivity, as a significant portion of the discussion is dedicated to the nature of subjective experience. What is the relationship between consciousness and subjectivity and reality itself, in which Psyche again emphasizes the uniqueness and the value of the first-person perspective that cannot be captured by third-person or reduced to the third-person scientific inquiry process. Other subject matter, metaphysics and ontology. Obviously, this first chapter is getting into metaphysics, ontology, into the very nature of reality itself, as to which metaphysical framework is the best explanation for reality as we experience it. And finally, one other philosophical term I'll throw out there that you can clearly see on display in chapter 1 is epistemology. This debate touches on the limits of human knowledge and understanding, particularly concerning the nature of consciousness and the capacity of science to fully explain truth. Well, this concludes part 1 of my series on David Bentley Hart's book, All Things Are Full of Gods, The Mysteries of Mind and Life. As this book demonstrates, dialogues are better than monologues. So tell me in the comments below your thoughts on chapter 1. I would love to read them. If you're listening on the audio-only podcast and you don't do YouTube, you can reach out to me on Twitter, or what some people call X, and share with me your thoughts there as well. Again, you're watching here on YouTube. Leave a comment below. And please, because we are going to go chapter by chapter, I might be getting too ambitious in my hopes of doing a chapter-by-chapter breakdown. I'd like to try, and we'll see how far we get. But because we're doing that, and if you have read ahead, please no spoilers on stuff in the other chapters, okay? I know this isn't a movie, but there can be things that might be spoiled by bringing up future dialogue. So let's focus our discussion in chapter 1's material. And then as we do other future episodes on the other chapters, feel free. We can cover things from previous chapters, but let's not go ahead in our public dialogue so as to not ruin anything for those that are enjoying the process of going through this book. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Again, you can support the work I'm doing on Patreon. And until next time, we'll talk again soon.